Adrian Blake used to sit in the front row of the church, not because anyone assigned him that seat. People simply expected him there, the successful businessman, the generous donor, the man everyone called blessed. But on a cold Thursday morning, 2 years after his name had been printed on plaques, thanked from pulpits, and whispered with admiration in church hallways, Adrian stood in a food donation line, wearing an old coat and keeping his head low. He did not want anyone to recognize him. His beard had grown uneven. His shoes were worn. The watch he once wore had been sold months ago. The man who had once funded church projects was now waiting for a box of groceries. He stared at the wet pavement beneath his feet, listening to people move slowly ahead of him. Then someone behind him whispered, "Isn't that Adrian Blake?" His shoulders stiffened. He did not turn around. The shame was too sharp. A few feet ahead, an elderly woman with a small shopping cart looked back at him. Her name was Miriam. She had attended the same church for years. Adrian remembered her vaguely. A quiet woman, always sitting near the side aisle, always wearing the same faded cardigan, always smiling like she knew something deeper than everyone else. He had passed her many times when he was rich. Polite nods, brief greetings, nothing more. But now, in the line he had once been too proud to imagine himself standing in, Miriam looked at him with no surprise and no pity, only tenderness. She stepped closer and said softly, "Sometimes God meets us in the line we were too proud to stand in." Adrian looked away. The words felt too close, too gentle, too dangerous, because Adrian did not want comfort. He wanted answers. He wanted the life he lost. He wanted the God he thought had betrayed him to explain why a man who had given so much could be brought so low. But what Adrian did not know was that the fall he called abandonment was the beginning of a mercy he had not yet learned to recognize. Adrian Blake had not always been hard. There was a time when his faith felt simple. Before the wealth, before the handshakes, before people stood when he entered certain rooms, before his name became attached to success. He and Naomi had started with very little, a small apartment, second-hand furniture, one old car, bills stacked on the kitchen counter. But they prayed together then. They laughed over cheap meals. They talked about serving God with whatever he placed in their hands. Naomi used to tell him, "If God gives us more, Adrian, let's make sure more does not take us from him." He would smile and kiss her forehead. It won't. At first, it did not. When Adrian's business began to grow, he gave generously. He helped fund the church pantry. He paid for repairs in the sanctuary. He sponsored youth camps. He gave to families in need. People admired him. And honestly, some of that admiration was deserved. He worked hard. He cared. He did not see himself as greedy. But success can enter the soul quietly, not as a monster, as a compliment, as comfort, as influence, as the feeling of being needed. Over time, Adrian began to enjoy the way people said his name. He liked being introduced as one of the most blessed men in the church. He liked when Pastor Elias thanked him publicly. He liked that younger men asked him for advice. He liked that other business owners treated him with respect. And slowly, his giving changed. Not in amount, in spirit. He still gave, but now part of him wanted to be seen giving. He still prayed, but mostly before decisions, he wanted God to bless. He still talked about faith, but often in the language of growth, increase, vision, expansion, legacy. Naomi saw the shift before anyone else. She noticed how Adrian became restless in simple places, how he no longer listened well to people who could not help his plans, how he started calling caution small thinking, how he dismissed her concerns by saying, "You just don't understand the level we're operating on now." The mansion came 5 years after the company's biggest expansion. It sat on a hill overlooking the city, with tall windows, marble floors, and a dining room large enough to host church leaders, investors, and charity dinners. Adrian said it would be used for God, and sometimes it was. But more often, it became a symbol that Adrian had made it, a symbol that his faith worked, a symbol that God's favor could be measured in square footage, polished stone, and the silence of impressed guests. Naomi never loved the house the way Adrian did. She was grateful, but she was cautious. And once, standing alone in the hallway after a lavish dinner, she placed her hand on the wall and whispered a prayer Adrian never heard. "Lord, if this house ever stops serving you, take it back." The first warning came through numbers. Adrian's company had grown too fast. New offices, new hires, new investors, bigger contracts, more visibility. He liked the pace. It made him feel alive. His partner, Victor Hale, warned him that some expansions were too aggressive. Naomi warned him that he was becoming difficult to confront. Even Lucas Reed, a longtime employee, tried once to speak honestly. "Mr. Blake, some of these projects are stretching the teams too thin." Adrian barely looked up from his tablet. "Growth always stretches people, Lucas." "I understand, sir." "But some of the numbers," Adrian interrupted. "Are you afraid of growth?" Lucas went quiet. That was often how conversations ended. People learned not to challenge Adrian too strongly. He called it confidence. But sometimes confidence is just pride that learned how to wear a suit. As pressure increased, Victor began hiding mistakes. Small ones at first. Delayed payments, risky transfers, documents signed too quickly. Reports softened before reaching Adrian's desk. Victor feared Adrian's reaction. Employees feared losing their jobs. Naomi feared the man her husband was becoming, but Adrian feared something too. He feared going backward. He feared being ordinary again. He feared discovering that his identity was not as strong as his image. So when problems appeared, he pushed harder. When debt increased, he expanded again. When Naomi asked if they should slow down, he said, "God did not bring us this far to live afraid." It sounded spiritual. But sometimes spiritual language can hide a heart unwilling to listen. Then came the collapse. One major client withdrew. Another contract fell apart. A lender demanded payment. Victor disappeared for 2 days. Employees panicked. Reports surfaced. Accounts were frozen. By the end of one terrible month, Adrian's company was no longer a monument to blessing. It was a burning building. And when everything began falling, Adrian did what many people do when they can no longer control the outcome. He looked for someone to blame. Victor, the economy, disloyal employees, jealous competitors, and finally, God. One night, standing in the mansion's dark kitchen, Adrian slammed his hand on the counter and said, "I gave to you. I served you. I honored you. And this is what you allow?" Naomi stood across from him with tears in her eyes. "Adrian, God is not a contract." He looked at her, wounded and furious. "No, apparently he is not faithful either." Naomi flinched. That was the night something changed. Not in God. In Adrian. The mansion was sold first, not by choice, by necessity. Adrian watched strangers walk through the rooms during the final showing. They commented on the windows, the floors, the view, as if it were just a house, as if every wall did not carry pieces of his pride. When the sale was finalized, Adrian stood in the empty foyer with a single box of belongings. Naomi walked beside him quietly. She had cried earlier, but now she was calm in a way that almost irritated him. "How can you be so composed?" he asked. She looked around the house one last time. "I am grieving too, Adrian." "You don't act like it." She turned to him. "Because I am trying not to worship what we are losing." The words struck him, but he rejected them. "You think this is about worship?" "I think it became about more than shelter." He laughed bitterly. "That is easy to say now." Naomi's eyes filled. "No, it was hard to say when we had everything." Adrian looked away. He did not want her wisdom. Wisdom felt like accusation when his pride was bleeding. Weeks later, after the house was gone and the company officially closed, Adrian stopped attending church. At first, people called. Pastor Elias left messages. Naomi continued going, sometimes alone, sometimes sitting in the back. Adrian refused. He said he needed time. But the truth was darker. He did not want to be seen diminished. He did not want to sit in a church where people remembered him as the man who used to give. He did not want to hear songs about God's faithfulness while feeling abandoned. One afternoon, Pastor Elias came to the small rental apartment where Adrian and Naomi had moved. Adrian opened the door reluctantly. The pastor's face was gentle. "I've missed you." Adrian said nothing. Pastor Elias continued, "Not your giving, not your influence. You." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Funny. The church seemed to miss my giving very loudly when I had it." The pastor absorbed the words without defensiveness. "Some people may have admired the wrong things. That does not mean God did." Adrian looked away. Pastor Elias said quietly, "God does not promise to protect our idols, Adrian. He promises to be God when they fall." Adrian's face hardened. "Then he can be God without me." He closed the door, and for the first time in years, Adrian intentionally walked away from faith. Not loudly, not publicly, just inwardly. He stopped praying, stopped opening scripture, stopped speaking to God, except in anger. And the silence that followed felt less like peace and more like a locked room. Poverty did not come all at once. It came in humiliations, selling the second car, canceling memberships, ignoring calls from people he once entertained, wearing the same jacket to interviews, explaining gaps, accepting smaller opportunities that never called back, seeing people from church in public and pretending not to notice their awkward kindness. Naomi took extra work. Adrian tried consulting, but most people who once admired him no longer answered quickly. Influence, he discovered, can evaporate faster than wealth. Then came the morning he stood in the food donation line. He had resisted going. Naomi suggested it gently. He snapped at her. "I am not standing in a charity line." She replied, "We have eaten because you once gave to places like this. Why is it noble when you give and shameful when you receive?" He had no answer, so he went. That was where he met Miriam. She stood with a small cart and a peaceful face. "Mrs. Miriam," he said, forcing politeness. She smiled. "Adrian." He expected discomfort. Instead, she treated him like a son who had come home late. As they moved forward in line, he noticed her hands. Thin, wrinkled, steady. She carried no embarrassment, no bitterness, no anger at being poor. That annoyed him. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. She looked at him. "Do what?" "Stand here like it doesn't bother you." Miriam considered the question. "Oh, it bothers me some days. But you're smiling." "I have cried too, child." He looked away. She continued. "I lost my husband. I lost my house years ago. I lost strength in my body. But I learned something slowly." "What?" She looked ahead at the volunteers placing groceries into boxes. "I do not serve God because my table is full. I serve him because even when my table is empty, he is still my Father." Adrian felt irritation rise again. Or maybe it was conviction. "That sounds beautiful until you lose everything." Miriam turned to him gently. "No, Adrian. It becomes beautiful after you lose what you thought was everything and discover he is still there." He said nothing. Then she added, "You were generous when you had much. That was good. But now God may be teaching you the grace of receiving." The line moved forward. Adrian wanted to leave, but he stayed. And for the first time, he wondered whether the poorest person in the line might be the richest one there. A month later, Adrian found Lucas Reed working at a community repair shop. Lucas had once been one of Adrian's most reliable employees. When the company collapsed, Adrian had signed Lucas's dismissal letter without looking him in the eyes. At the time, he told himself there was no room for emotion in survival. But now, standing in the doorway of the repair shop, he remembered Lucas's face that day. Calm, hurt, dignified. Lucas looked up from a workbench and recognized him immediately. "Mr. Blake." Adrian almost corrected him. Almost said, "Just Adrian." But pride still had reflexes. "I heard you might know of work," Adrian said. Lucas wiped his hands with a cloth. "Maybe." The silence between them carried history. Adrian cleared his throat. "I know things ended badly." Lucas looked at him. "You signed the paper and walked out before I could ask how I was supposed to tell my wife." Adrian lowered his eyes. "I was under pressure." So was I. The words were not angry. They were honest. Lucas walked to a shelf and picked up a set of keys. There's a church shelter renovating rooms across town. They need help painting, fixing doors, moving furniture. It's not much. Adrian's pride recoiled. Manual labor. Temporary work for low pay. He almost refused. But rent was due, so he accepted. Before Adrian left, Lucas said, "You know, I was angry at you for a long time." Adrian turned. "But I decided I would not let your coldness decide who I became." The sentence followed Adrian all day. At the shelter, he sanded old door frames until his hands ached. No one knew he had once managed millions. No one cared. He was just another man, with paint on his sleeves. That evening, he came home exhausted and ashamed. Naomi placed dinner on the small table. He sat down heavily. "I used to employ people to do what I did today." Naomi sat across from him. And now I am nothing." Her expression softened. "No, Adrian. Now you are without the things that helped you avoid that question." He stared at her. "What question? Who are you?" And no one is impressed. He had no answer. That night, he walked into the bathroom, closed the door, turned on the sink so Naomi would not hear, and wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because for the first time, he was not grieving only what he lost. He was grieving the man he had become, while he still had it. The turning point began with Victor. For months, Adrian had imagined confronting his former partner. In his mind, Victor was the villain, the traitor, the reason everything collapsed. When Adrian finally found him in a modest office outside the city, Victor looked older, thinner, and far less powerful than Adrian remembered. "I wondered when you would come," Victor said. Adrian's voice was cold. "You destroyed my life." Victor did not deny his failures. "I hid mistakes." "You stole from me?" "No." "You lied." "Yes." Adrian stepped closer. "Why?" Victor's eyes sharpened with old pain. "Because everyone lied around you, Adrian. Not always with words, sometimes with silence. You created a room where telling the truth felt like betrayal." Adrian's face hardened. "Don't put this on me." Victor opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "I made bad decisions. I will answer for them. But you signed off on the expansions. You ignored warnings. You wanted growth faster than the company could survive." He placed papers on the desk. Adrian recognized his signature. Again and again. Victor continued. "You wanted the image, the interviews, the donors' dinners, the plaques. You wanted to be the man God had blessed too much to question." Adrian's anger flared, but the documents were real. Victor leaned back, exhausted. "I am not innocent, but I was not the only builder of that altar." That word pierced him. Altar. Adrian left without another word. For hours, he drove aimlessly. Then, almost without thinking, he found himself parked outside the old mansion. His mansion. Except it was not his anymore. The iron gates were open. A new sign stood near the driveway. "Grace House Family Shelter." Adrian stared at it. His hands went cold. He stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the entrance. Children's voices echoed from inside. A woman carried blankets through the foyer. A volunteer pushed a cart of food down the hallway. The chandelier still hung above the entrance, but beneath it were donated shoes, coats, and backpacks. The room where Adrian once hosted wealthy guests now held families with nowhere else to go. He stood frozen. A staff member approached. "Can I help you?" Before Adrian could answer, Lucas appeared from a side room carrying a toolbox. He stopped when he saw him. "You didn't know?" Adrian shook his head. Lucas looked around. The ministry bought it after the sale. They've been turning it into a shelter. Adrian could barely speak. "This was my house." Lucas nodded. "Maybe now it's becoming what it was meant to be." Those words undid him. He walked through the foyer like a man seeing his life interpreted by mercy. The dining room was now a community meal space. The guest rooms held mothers and children. The office where he once calculated expansion was now used for counseling. His symbol of greatness had become a refuge for the broken. And for the first time, Adrian wondered if the loss had not been the end of God's faithfulness. Maybe it had been the interruption of his idolatry. Adrian's story reveals a truth many people do not want to face. It is possible to have God's blessings and slowly begin to love the blessings more than God. Wealth is not evil by itself. Success is not sin by itself. A beautiful home, a growing business, influence, comfort, and generosity can all be used for good. But Jesus warned in Matthew 6:21, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." The heart follows treasure, and sometimes, without noticing, a person can move God from the throne to the language of their life. They still mention Him. They still thank Him. They still give in His name. But the true center becomes control, image, comfort, and status. Adrian did not lose faith because he became poor. Poverty revealed the foundation his faith had been standing on. Philippians 4:12-13 shows a different kind of faith. Paul said he knew how to be brought low, and he knew how to abound. He knew abundance and need. And then he said, "I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." That verse is not mainly about winning every earthly victory. It is about Christ being enough in every condition. Abundance did not own Paul. Need did not destroy him, because his strength was not in circumstance. It was in Christ. Job 1:21 gives one of the hardest confessions in Scripture. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Nalkik, that does not mean loss is painless. It does not mean grief is unspiritual. It means true worship is not built only on full barns, open doors, and answered plans. Sometimes, the deepest worship comes from a heart that has lost what it held too tightly and still chooses to say, "God, you are still God." Adrian thought God was taking everything from him, but God was exposing what everything had become. And that exposure, painful as it was, became mercy. Because God does not tear down idols because He is cruel. He tears them down because idols make terrible gods. They demand everything. They give no peace. They cannot save. But when they fall, the heart can finally see the Father again. Naomi came to Grace's house on a Saturday afternoon. Adrian was in the former dining room, helping assemble simple wooden beds. He looked different now. Not fully healed, not suddenly humble in every way, but softer, quieter, less afraid of being unseen. Naomi stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him help Lucas carry a mattress into a room that used to hold expensive wine cabinets. When Adrian saw her, he stopped. "I didn't know you were coming." She smiled gently. "I wanted to see it." They walked slowly through the house. Naomi touched the wall in the hallway. Her eyes filled with tears. "I prayed here once," she said. Adrian looked at her. "In this hallway?" She nodded. "After one of our dinners, everyone was praising the house, praising us, praising what we had built." She swallowed. "And I felt afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That we were losing the ability to tell the difference between God's presence and people's admiration." Adrian looked down. "What did you pray?" Naomi's voice trembled. "I prayed, Lord, if this house ever stops serving you, take it back." Adrian went still. For a long moment, the sounds of the shelter faded. Children laughing somewhere upstairs. A cart rolling down the hall. Voices in the kitchen. All of it became distant. "You prayed that?" he whispered. "I did not pray for destruction," Naomi said quickly, tears falling now. "I prayed for mercy. I prayed that God would not let His blessing become our idol." Adrian turned away, covering his mouth. The truth was too much. All this time, he had accused God of betrayal. But perhaps God had been answering a prayer Adrian had been too proud to pray. He walked into the old living room. There were no designer chairs now, no polished decorations, no framed awards. There were blankets, donated toys, folding chairs, and a small wooden cross on the wall. A little girl sat at a table coloring while her mother rested nearby. Adrian looked around the room where he once entertained powerful men and realized it had never felt more holy than it did now. Naomi stood beside him. His voice broke. "I thought God took my house from me," Naomi whispered. Maybe he gave it back to himself. Adrian closed his eyes. Something inside him surrendered. Not everything. Not perfectly. But truly. That evening, after everyone left, Adrian remained in the shelter's small chapel room. It used to be his private office. Now there were chairs, a Bible on a table, and a cross made from reclaimed wood. He knelt slowly. For months, he had not prayed without anger. But now the words came differently. Lord, I called you unfaithful because you touched what I worshipped. His voice trembled. I gave you my donations, but I kept my throne. He bowed his head. I am sorry. The room was quiet. No applause, no recognition, no title, no wealth. Just a man finally poor enough to receive grace. Adrian did not become rich again by the end of that week. The company did not return. The mansion did not become his again. The influential friends did not suddenly come back. That would have been too easy, and not nearly as holy. Instead, Adrian began again. Small, humbled, slower. He continued working at Grace House. At first, because he needed income. Later, because something in him came alive when serving without being celebrated. He learned the names of families staying there. He fixed broken doors, painted rooms, carried boxes, sat with men who had lost jobs, listened to mothers who were trying to rebuild. And each room taught him something. The foyer taught him that image fades. The dining room taught him that tables are holier when the hungry are fed. The bedrooms taught him that shelter matters more than status. The chapel taught him that God's presence was never purchased by prosperity. Miriam continued to come to the food pantry. One day, Adrian saw her placing a few coins quietly into the donation box. He almost told her she did not need to give. But then he stopped, because he remembered the widow's heart. He remembered that generosity is not measured only by amount, but by surrender. Lucas became more than a former employee. He became a friend. Victor eventually faced consequences for the choices he had hidden. But Adrian stopped using Victor's failure to avoid his own. Naomi and Adrian were not instantly restored. Trust needed rebuilding. Conversations were sometimes painful. But prayer returned to their home. Not the polished prayers Adrian used to make at public events. Simple prayers, honest prayers, hungry prayers. And one evening, months later, Adrian stood outside Grace House as families walked in from the cold. He looked at the building that once displayed his success. Now it displayed mercy. And for the first time, he did not want it back. Maybe you know what Adrian learned the hard way. Maybe you have never lived in a mansion. Maybe you have never owned a company. But almost everyone knows what it means to build identity on something that can be lost. Money, status, approval, comfort, a relationship, a dream, a position, a version of life you thought proved God was with you. And maybe when something fell, you wondered if God had abandoned you. But what if the fall was not abandonment? What if it was exposure? What if God was not destroying you, but freeing you from something that could never save you? This story is not saying every loss is easy to understand. It is not saying pain does not matter. It is not saying financial struggle is simple. But it is saying this: God is too loving to let his gifts become your God without confronting your heart. Adrian thought poverty stole his faith, but poverty revealed what his faith had been leaning on. And when everything false fell, the Father was still there, not impressed by his wealth, not ashamed of his poverty, still calling him home. The mansion was gone. The image was gone. The applause was gone. But grace remained. And sometimes that is the miracle. Not that God gives back every idol, but that he gives back himself. If this story spoke to your heart, write the word surrender in the comments. Let it be a simple prayer. Lord, take back every place in my heart that belongs to you. If this video helped you reflect, leave a like and subscribe for more Christian stories about faith, surrender, healing, and new beginnings. And remember, God does not destroy a life by tearing down its idols. He saves the heart from what was never meant to sit on the throne.